From the first covenant, Yahweh presented an image of a harsh, daunting God. His character almost demanded the birth of an entity like Shekhinah. Also, he could not be seen by human eyes, and only a few prophets heard his voice. Yet almost every religion shows that human nature seeks intimacy with a deity. The manifestation of a loving maternal entity, ready to defend her people even from God himself, brings a feeling of comfort that a paternal, invisible entity like Yahweh cannot bestow upon his worshippers. Shekhinah represents compassion in its purest form, and despite being, officially, the female side of God, she was visible and audible as a feminine entity in her own right. A beautiful being of light, whose most important function was to intercede with God on behalf of her children. Such an entity had to come into being to soften the harshness of the original Judaism. But how did such a complex entity develop? It started with the changing of God's dwelling. During biblical times, people assumed God dwelled in the clouds. When the Israelites built the desert tabernacle, and later, Solomon's temple, Yahweh descended in a cloud and dwelt there. Slowly, the manifested entity became stronger. A complete distinction appears in a Talmudic quotation from the end of the 1st century BCE. While the children of Israel were still in Egypt, the Holy One, blessed be He, stipulated that he would liberate them from Egypt only in order that they built him a sanctuary so that he can let his Shekhinah dwell among them. As soon as the tabernacle was erected, the Shekhinah descended and dwelt among them. Another quotation from early 3rd century says, "On that day a thing came about which had never existed since the creation of the world." From the creation of the world and up to that hour the Shekhinah had never dwelt among the lower beings. But from the time that the tabernacle was erected, she did dwell among them. Another tradition claimed that she had always dwelt among her people, but their sins drove her, on and off, into heaven. However, she was drawn back to her children and tried to save them, over and over. By that time, her image was so ingrained into real historical events, that when the Jews were exiled to Babylonia, she transferred her seat there, and appeared alternately in 2 major synagogues. She often made herself visible to the congregations there, particularly in one synagogue, which was built of stones and dust taken from a holy place in Jerusalem. As the Jews dispersed further, sightings occurred in Italy, Spain, Germany, Poland, Russia, in every town where Jews lived. Shekhinah comforted the sick, the poor, the suffering, and had a particular concern for repentant sinners. They are carried aloft and seated next to the Shekhinah, he whose heart is broken and whose spirit is low, and whose mouth rarely utters a word. The Shekhinah walks with him every day. The paradox of dwelling in one place, and being in various places and with many people at the same time, had to be resolved. The Talmud reconciled the 2 ideas beautifully in a well-known anecdote. The emperor said to Rabban Gamaliel, "You say that wherever 10 men are assembled, the Shekhinah dwells among them." As time went by, her position strengthened. An interesting medieval anecdote shows the Shekhinah as a total separate entity in her most important role, interceding on behalf of her children. The Shekhinah comes to the defense of sinful Israel by saying first to Israel, "Be not a witness against thy neighbor without a cause," and then thereafter saying to God, "Say not, I will do to him as he hath done to me." This is obviously a conversation taking place among 3 distinct entities, Israel, God, and the Shekhinah. Another significant passage from the 11th century describes Rabbi Akiva, a 2nd century sage, saying, "When the Holy One, blessed be He, considered the deeds of the generation of Enoch and that they were spoiled and evil, he removed himself and his Shekhinah from their midst and ascended into the heights with blasts of trumpets." Like any good mother, she could punish too. When she behaved violently, her character came closer to her powerful aspect of the great Asherah, Yahweh's Canaanite consort. She descended to earth to punish Adam, Eve, and the serpent when they sinned at the Garden of Eden. She confused the builders of the Tower of Babel. She drowned the Egyptians at the Red Sea crossing during Exodus. When needed, she even killed righteous people. Since the beginning of time, 6 people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, could not be taken by the angel of death because of their perfect purity. Someone had to bring their souls to heaven, and only Shekhinah could do that. By kissing them, she released their souls from bondage to this world. In a particularly touching story, after kissing and releasing Moses' soul, she carried his body for a long distance on her wings, to his secret grave. According to the legends, Moses had to live apart from his wife so that he would always be pure enough to communicate with the Shekhinah. This gave rise to the curious myth, later elaborated on in the Kabbalah, that Moses and Shekhinah lived as husband and wife. The image of Shekhinah, carrying the dead body of her husband to his final resting place, resembles the myth of Anath, carrying the body of her husband Baal to his burial place. Nor is this the end of her development. The Kabbalah greatly elaborated on the theme of the feminine aspect of God. She would appear as the powerful queen, bride of God, celebrated every Saturday by Jews all over the world as they light the Sabbath candles. And by tradition, the candles must always be lit by a woman.